Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Disruptive Leaders in Technology. I am joined here today by Dr. Yasmine Ndassa, previously Global Head of Data and Analytics with Meta. Had an unbelievably impressive career and impressive background. Very honoured and privileged that you're here today for today's episode. I know you and I have had a couple of conversations leading up to today, but like I've said to you many times, I think that the community and the data community would be very intrigued and very interested to hear from someone like yourself within the industry. So just to kind of get straight into it, then I guess the first topic we really wanted to push into with you and unpack is definitely your career journey and your career progression, because to me, it seems extremely intriguing. I know you obviously have now left from Meta, but it's obviously one of the biggest tech companies in the world. And you're obviously one of the most senior executives there and had a very interesting role there. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about where you can go into. But just to kind of get started, like what led you to a world and a career of data and analytics?
Yes, well, first of all, thank you. Good morning, everyone, or afternoon. Thank you, Sam, and thank you, Lawrence Harvey, for the opportunity to have this conversation. Yes, my journey, to be honest, my professional journey has been the surprise of my life. And every day I wake up and I pinch myself by how much I am living a life that I could not have imagined when I was in college. So I started my training. I'm trained as a molecular biophysicist. And I started my career in STEM, being in a research lab studying HIV proteins in undergrad at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and
Yeah.
then went to Harvard to pursue my PhD in molecular biophysics. I studied cancer proteomics. And the reality is that, to answer your question, um, it is all very seamless to me because what I was going for was just really exploring the opportunity to be trained to solve problem in a very structured way. I've always, my favorite question when I was younger, my mom told me was why, right? I asked why
Yeah.
about 5 times before I shut up. And I think it naturally kind of made me fit into that space to understand how how science work, how to solve problems using the scientific method. And I realized even when I was in grad school that I had the way my brain worked. I'm very much of a systems thinker, right? I'm fascinated by complex networks and
Yeah.
understanding how they work, where the nodes are, where the high traffic, so on and so forth, and then simplifying them
Hmm.
either in terms of from a efficiency standpoint or simplifying the explanation, the communication about how the network works. So that translator role is one that I brought from my academic background into business. And my career path really has been about, I used to call myself, I'm a scientist in business, right? So the career, I designed my career to apply the scientific method
Yeah.
in business,
Yeah.
right? At the end of the day, for whatever business challenge have been presented to me, they started with an observation, right?
Yeah.
The observation led to a conversation around different reasons why this business phenomenon might be happening,
Yeah.
i.e., hypothesis.
Yeah.
And based on those hypotheses, I would define the analysis framework to then go into the data to pull the information needed to test those hypotheses, analyze the result, and come back to my stakeholders to explain to them, this is what I found, and this is why, these are my recommendations, these are the impacts, this is how we're going to measure it, so on and so forth. And
Yeah.
so it was very much a natural evolution from being a biomedical researcher to being in analytics because the
Yeah.
methodology is the same. It's just that instead of looking at DNA, protein, and RNA data, I am now looking at business data.
Yeah.
But the mechanics of solving the problems are the same, and I've enjoyed every aspect of it.
Yeah, I mean, and it's such a common transition as well. I think that obviously I'm just a recruiter in this space, so I understand it to maybe a 2 out of 10, and then everyone in the field is obviously experts in that field. But whenever we are recruiting with companies and we're supporting them, those quantitative educational backgrounds, so your physics, your chemistry, your biology, as obviously, they fall just in the line as computer science degrees do as well, because I think the way it's data science, right? It's you're trying to prove your hypothesis wrong, and which results in many, I guess, I think we talked about this a couple of episodes ago with either Ben Littman-Ass. I think we're talking about it's data science. It's a science. You're setting yourself out on a task with a hypothesis. You're trying to prove it wrong, and then if you can't prove it wrong, it becomes a law in a way. And that's kind of
Yes,
how.
or you find out what is happening based on that investigation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then when like you say, when you take it, obviously here you were looking at like cancer cells and the things you were looking at, the proteins and stuff. And then on this side, and probably what's been most of your career now, has been looking at data around business, whether it's any different area of business, which I'm sure everyone sort of listening is aware. You can use data science and analytics and anything across almost any element of a business. And I think, as proven, you obviously working specifically within like that HR and that recruiting side of Meta at the time, and I'm sure you back in your Comcast days as well. You're probably leveraging it into many different ways. But the way you sort of described how you got started in your interest and how it's progressed is just applying the same principles in a little bit of a different way.
Exactly, because it's basically the analogy that I can give is being a bean counter. The activity is the same. Instead of being a bean counter, you become an orange counter, for lack of better words, right? And so the mechanics are the same. It is just the what that you are studying, and of course, very importantly, the context of the work that you do changes. For every work that is done, even within a certain function within analytics, every business challenge that is presented has a different business context and a different outcome that the company is trying to achieve, and so that has a lot of influence in the framework that you apply to go after that investigation.
Yeah, and I guess the skill set from there, and probably what's led to your success is the understanding of how it applies to the different areas of a business. Because there's different contexts, there's different perceptions and things like that. So talk to me about some of the obstacles you might have faced in your career then, and would love to sort of paint a trials and tribulations sort of story of your career path. I'm sure it's not been extremely smooth all along the way, but coming from that science background and then working your way through different industries, different companies, like has there ever been like a really tough time where you've had to adapt or overcome certain obstacles that you.
Yeah, certainly. I can share a couple. So the first really that I encountered was straight out of grad school. I joined the Boston Consulting Group as a strategy consultant,
Oh, wow.
and it was a magical experience. I mean, to this day, I
Yeah.
consider myself a BCGer, and I thought that I had been prepared to solve problems, be given 6 years of grad school and countless hours in the lab and all that kind of things, until I realized that the way to do storytelling in business is very different than the way you do storytelling in science.
Yeah, okay.
And the example that I like to give is that the outcome of analysis in science is a peer-reviewed article, right? That is how scientists kind of define their successes and share the insight that they've generated with the rest of the community.
Yeah.
And the way those scientific articles are structured, they start with some basic introduction, and then they go into the results and methodology, and no, the methodology and then the result and then the conclusion. That's the basic architecture of a scientific article. In business, as I learned as a strategy consultant very fast, nobody cares about the methodology. What your client is asking for is an answer. right? So you need to make sure that you understand what the question is, what is the business question that you're supposed to be answering. Go and do the analysis, whether you use regression analysis and all kind of very complex methodology to get to the answer and go through your investigation. As a geek, you enjoy and want to talk about it. But by the time you come to in front of the client to talk about the so what and the now what, that methodology section, nobody cares. Or at least not at first, right? And so it was one of the biggest transition and trials that I went through, reframing my thinking about storytelling to make sure that I adapted it to this new audience that I was faced with, which are business leaders, not academics, who have a 2 minute, if you're lucky, more like 30-second attention span. And if you don't catch their attention in terms of the value of the result of this analysis within the first 15 seconds, you lose them. If you're lucky and there's someone who is very data savvy in the group, they may ask eventually about the methodology, and your neurons start firing up and you get really excited to talk about XYZ. But that's usually a follow-up conversation. And so that was one of my first aha as part of this transition from science into business. The other one, and I think we're going to talk about this a little later, was the value of understanding how an organization works and what are the different parts of that organization that are the input and the outputs to your work. And what I mean by that is that as a scientist, you create your own data, right? You set up the experiment, you analyze like you create your own data, and you own the process end to end. In analytics in a business setting, and I've learned that at Comcast, where I spent 11 fantastic years at headquarters in Philly, I learned very early on that it was important for me to trace the data back to its source. And along the way, understand what are the business processes that generate that data, right? So, and what it meant for me was that because I was my first role at Comcast was to start HR analytics at a time where analytics was not defined. So it was a lot, it was a lot of fun. But before I went too deep into any of it, I went and spent time in our call centers. I did tech ride-alongs, like literally spending a day with the technician, going from customers to understand what they were doing, but also from an analytics standpoint, understand at what point in that customer as well as technician experience data was being collected. So that when I sit on my computer and I see a table that has 1,500 fields, I understand, I can almost see the human being behind the data.
Of course.
Right. So you have to understand the business process before you can frame an analytics kind of strategy. And so that was one of the I don't know that I can call it a trial and tribulation as much as a learning earlier in my career to make sure that I don't sit on the analytics ivory tower, and make sure that I understand the different part of the ecosystem and make friends with them, because there's a lot of value in understanding how those hands-off happen, and because they refine the quality of the insight.
And I think that's an underappreciated skill set, especially within your role, because you're dealing with so many different teams, and you're probably talking to people a lot of the times where, like you say, the methodology doesn't get spoken about that much. So like most of the time, they don't really know what you're doing, but by building those relationships with people and building that trust and talking to them and making sure that they know that you understand at least their side and what they're talking about, then you can go to your methodology and bring it back.
Exactly. If need be. Sometimes the methodology is totally irrelevant, right? If you've established that trust, they may not want to know about your methodology. If they are curious about it because they want to apply it for other parts of the business, then it's a different story.
It's very interesting. I think that do you think, I was going to say the word lucky, but not lucky, but do you feel fortunate that in your career, obviously you went from having incredibly impressive educational chapter of your life, and then into a company like BCG. I mean, we work with BCG, so we know how impressive and how rigorous it and how tough it is to become a BCGer, as you mentioned. Um, but do you feel fortunate that like you probably learned, I'm not putting words in your mouth here, but learned that skill set of how to engage with the different customers and clients and let them know that you understand what they're talking about and you understand what their business need is, and you're going to go away with your own methodology that you don't need to explain to them, but like almost just like, trust me, we'll come back with a solution.
Yes, very much so. It was my time at BCG was the most formative and accelerated transition into business that I could have ever dreamt of.
Yeah,
And it had several components, right? It had there's a boot camp that BCG, at least back then, took a non-traditional hires, which are people who don't have an MBA. That's what they were called at the time. Put you through. They will put us through basically a mini MBA boot camp to make sure that we understand basic for the fundamentals of business.
yeah,
And then for each engagement that I had, there were the project leaders and the partners always kind of made themselves available for me to learn along the way.
yeah,
But one of the things that I certainly learned as at BCG was the value of active listening, right?
yeah,
It is listening to the client and paying attention to the white space, i.e., the things that they are not saying that are corollaries of the things that they are saying.
yeah, yeah,
And paying attention to that is key to kind of optimizing the efficiency of the process, right? Because otherwise you have a little too many cycles if you don't pay attention up front. The first iteration of an analysis may not be as on point. And again, trust is earned. And
yeah,
so you want to take every opportunity that you have with your stakeholders to make them feel heard,
yeah,
but also to establish yourself as a partner who can help them solve the problems and add value to whatever the strategy is. So that was certainly an amazing experience that BCG brought. I will say that the exercise of figuring out and finding out who the different stakeholders are in order to get that insight is
yeah,
actually a skill that I learned as a scientist, because science doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? And it just so happened that my PhD thesis was done in collaboration with a genetics lab at Dana-Farber. And so that sense of collaboration is very much innate to how I do what I do, because I'm very comfortable and confident in my abilities and my strengths,
yeah,
but there's a whole lot that I don't know. And so those partnership and that collaboration, knowing where my strength ends and my collaborators' strength start,
yeah,
so that we can make something that is better than what we could create individually,
yeah.
is really a continuation of my training also.
Awesome. And then you've obviously progressed substantially throughout your career, and it's been a long endured career, and obviously one that's going to continue to keep going. But how has your sort of career development and your growth evolved throughout your career? Are there any sort of, I guess, is there any, if you were to speak to someone that was 21 years old, just graduating with a master's of computer science from, a good school or whatever they want to do, but um, what is there any bits of advice that you would give to someone like that in terms of how to progress and grow their career? Because you can be the most technical person in the room, but like you say, if you don't understand the business and you don't build that trust and you don't work with the stakeholders and you don't do all these other softer skills and things,
Mhm.
is there anything there that you've learned throughout time that you would definitely give advice to someone just getting started in their career?
I certainly will, because when you are early in that journey, it's almost you need someone to give you a chance to flex muscles that you don't have, right? And so one of the advice that I actually give to my mentees is to realize that whatever job they have is a subset of all of the things that they can do in order
Yeah.
to demonstrate the skill set that they need to demonstrate at the next level.
Yeah.
And the best example that I can give for that is that when I started at Comcast, I was a director, I was an individual contributor. Basically, I was doing all the work with myself, right? And it was fun because I needed to understand how we did what we did. Um, and so when it came, but I also knew that I wanted to become a people leader. And it was in the direct kind of path that I was on, it wasn't something that was going to be immediate. And so I took the opportunity to take a leadership role with a extra professional organization called NAMIC, National
Yeah.
Association for Minority in Communication, and be the chapter president. And by virtue of kind of taking that role and really evolving that chapter to a one that was relatively dormant to one that was award winning by the end of my tenure, I've been able to make the case for myself at the time
Yeah.
that I have leadership skills, right? And so they were not directly in line with my analytics job. They were still within the context of Comcast, and I could demonstrate those skills as by looking at my experience in its totality.
Yeah.
And so one of the advice that I give to my mentees, and I'll give to someone earlier in their career, is to pay attention to look to the left and to the right. Your technical skills are always something that you can spend 100% of your time on, but reserve a good 20% for, to your point earlier, the soft skills, the collaboration skills, developing a business acumen, which are things that you may not always be invited to the meetings that your bosses and your boss's boss attend.
Yeah.
But by partnering and getting to know the people across the organization, you develop that business acumen in ways that actually enriches your analytics.
Yeah.
And so that's really something that I found valuable. And of course, finding mentors and sponsors, knowing the difference between the two. Sometimes your sponsors, you don't know who your sponsors are. With your mentors, you might be a little bit more deliberate about them. And so those are the two pieces that I would give up front.
Yeah. And I think just the bit you touched on at the end as well is like treat everyone with respect and stuff, even if you have a bit of a disagreement in a meeting here and there and things like that. Like, you don't know who's your sponsors and you don't know who's gonna be putting in a good word for you here and there. So that obviously that's not really a data analytics that applies that applies to everything, right?
One of my sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but what you
No.
just said reminded me of one of my mentors, Dr. Freeman Rabowski, who was the president of UMBC, my college alma mater. Used to tell us that your true characters is what you do when you think nobody's watching.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And so, to your point, it is in any meeting, whether you agree or disagree, the way you conduct yourself determine whether somebody would want to vouch for you when you're not in the room.
Yeah.
And that is what can make the difference between a promotion, a special project, a rotation opportunity, you name it.
Yeah.
So having that in mind is important.
Yeah, 100%. Like you say, it doesn't need to be even as big as a promotion. It could be an opportunity to go back to what you said earlier, an opportunity to flex some muscles that you don't quite have yet. And then the more times you get those opportunities, purely based on relationships and people talking nicely about you and putting a good word in for you, then those muscles are going to grow. A big theme of this conversation so far has definitely been relationships, I would say. Which is a good little segue into the next topic, is that relationships between, because you've obviously sat more on the data analytics and the data science side of things. And you and I have talked about this very briefly already, but the importance of that relationship that the data science analytics side of things has with the engineering side of things. Because the engineering side, correct me if I'm wrong here, is more like the input this is where the data comes in. It's that factory of all this crazy unstructured data is coming through. And I mean, you've been at Comcast, you've been at Meta. There's probably, doesn't get bigger, than that, really. Let's face it. But the thing that we talked about very briefly before was that often doesn't sit in the same org. Like the data engineering is like, where does the data engineering sit? Where's data science analytics sit? Why are they not sat together? And then if they're not sat together, how does that relationship form? And what's the importance of that relationship forming? So, I mean, definitely please talk to your experience there. You've probably seen those relationships from many different angles and things. But yeah, talk to me about first of all, talk to me about the importance of the relationship between the data engineering side, the data science and analytics side.
Yes, I think it is a critical partnership that the best organizations make sure that the org structure either reflects it, or there are platform and forums where the two come to the table in a way that is more strategic than transactional. And what I mean by that is this. As it makes sense, right? The IT organization, or the data on the engineering teams that fall under the CTO, for example, it makes sense for them to be a standalone because they have responsibility across the entire enterprise. It is making sure that the network for the actual running of the business is up and running, the network that supports the product or the service, so on and so forth.
Yeah.
On the other side, you have, depending on the approach that the company has taken, either federated or centralized analytics team. Federated team means there is a small analytics group in each function that is the first line of defense, or the first line of request for analytics insight. Centralized is there is a central business intelligence or analytics group that may have kind of assignment for different stakeholders across the company. Whatever that model is, that team is usually the recipient of the questions that come from the business leaders. Okay, because they are the stakeholders.
Yeah.
And best case scenario, the way that the team is structured or is built has a good documentation of the data map, right? The tables where the different data sources are, whether it's Workday, SAP, you name it.
Yeah.
And the programming skills that the analysts on those teams and data scientists have on those skills allow them to extract data using different BI tools to do the analysis. The value of bridging the two is, for me, in my experience, has come from really making sure that people, and as an analytics professional, you understand where your data is coming from and how it gets there. The people who have that information, they usually sit on the engineering team, because the engineering team owns the data infrastructure on which that literally the pipeline through which that data moves. And they also, you have the ecosystem that frames that data in ways that allows you as the next user to leverage it as best as possible. And so as an analytics professional, the confidence with which you can stand behind a recommendation is actually dictated by how well you understand how that data is acquired across the business. And that requires conversation with data engineers. And in my experience, data engineers have taught me way more than I thought at the beginning of my career. And that is because if the absence of that collaboration means that you only know what is at the surface. There are a lot of data that is collected through in systems across organizations that is not tapped. And so when a business question comes, you think that you're limited to these fields because these are the tables that you're the most, that when you were onboarded, you were told these are the tables that have the fields that you need. You sit down with data engineers, they will tell you, no, we collect data from these set of boxes there, and well, nobody touches them, but we collect the data. And immediately you make quantum leaps in terms of one, the type of connections that you can make between the different data sources, but also the quality of the insight that you generate. And so it's from the moment I realized that early in my career at Comcast, I always made it a priority when I interview for a role to request that I speak with the data engineer lead for that supports that organization, because they tell me those conversations help me understand what is actually possible from an analytics standpoint. And it also allows to build a relationship that that influences the technology decisions that are made by the data engineers, right? They provide the data, and a lot of times the end users in analytics, we don't come back to share with them how we use the data that they make available to us. When you sit down and actually share that with them, then they can kind of see what opportunities for optimizations are. And that informs those technology decisions that actually strengthen the tech stack. So the two-way feedback that those collaboration kind of lead to are very powerful. I'm hugely passionate about this topic as
yeah. And so do you think, I guess from that, I mean, you obviously talked about ways where there can be a more effective and there can be a more efficient communication relationship there. Because you've obviously seen where the data engineering has sat under, let's say, IT. Do you think it just makes sense to just everything should just, like, across all organizations, if you're going to have a data practice, the data team should sit under the data, P&L, that's what it is? Or do you think it makes sense how it works now? There just needs to be better communication between the two.
To be realistic, I think better communication is more important than reorging, right? Because the legacy and the reasons why organizations are structured the way they are may have to be more with how the business has evolved and so on and so forth. Now, having that stronger communication as a starting point for that collaboration is to me is the first priority. Then as that collaboration evolves, it may become much more organic to identify where the two teams may need to sit under the same umbrella, because the business context to remove friction between the two, because one may not have the business context needed to decide on the technology stack, and the people who do the analysis need to share how they use the data with the people. But first priority to me is better collaboration, and it doesn't require anything more than setting up a weekly, bi-weekly, monthly cadence with the teams that own the data that you use.
And then obviously the communication there and everything you touched on with, like, they can tell you really what's possible, because they know, I guess they know what stock they have in the warehouse.
They know the whole universe. And so, and honestly, they know all of the data that is coming through. They may not always know what are the questions that are being asked that data can answer. And so that's really the value of that communication. You as an analytics leader speak to, here are the business questions that are coming our way that we are not able to answer to our satisfaction. Will you share that? The data engineer can tell you, here, all of the data that we have, what these questions, here's a table that nobody touches, where you might be able to find some goodness.
That's the biggest tip. I've also been working in this space myself for 7 years now, but like that is something I'm probably going to be telling a lot of people, especially like, when we're recruiting for executive level roles and we've got, candidates interviewing through us at those roles, going into those final interviews as well. I'd be like, we should definitely be asking every single time, like, can we get that communication set up with the VP of engineering, the SVP of data engineering, whoever it may be, because one of the biggest frustrations, I think, of data leaders is that lack of communication there, and then not enough buy-in to be able to do the things that you want to do as a data science analytics leader. But if you could figure that out during the interview process, that the data engineering leader could have already told you, like, what you want to do is not going to be possible with the data we have right now or how it's set up. So that's a great point. But like, I guess like taking that, sort out the communication piece with the collaboration of it then.
Mm-hmm.
I guess we just kind of covered it really, but like in summary, it is just purely how often should you be communicating? Daily, weekly, monthly? Like how do you collaborate on there to make sure that it's just a seamless thing, from the executives asking their questions to you coming up with, I guess, the questions and the methodologies that we talked about earlier, to then the data engineering side being able to tell you what's possible with the ideas that you're having over here. How
Yes.
what's that supply chain of collaboration look like to you in an ideal world?
So I will say, in an ideal world, with everything working great, bi-weekly should be fine for at a transactional level. So I'll give you an example. One of the best practices that I have experienced was actually at Meta, and it was quite phenomenal. So it was one of those cases where before accepting the job, I asked to speak with the head of people inside who run, people data.
Yeah.
And she shared with me kind of the ecosystem and the data architecture of the company, which I thought was had a lot of great kind of potential for a lot of the things that I'm very excited to do in the HR analytics space. And so, to answer your question more directly, there are several layers to this, right? Once a year, at least once a year, I'll say 1 to 2 times a year, there needs to be a strategic conversation that relates to the roadmap
Yeah.
of both organizations, right? Because analytics, at least the way that I see analytics is at the service of strategy or business strategy. So the CEO sets the goal, and the analytics team kind of works to measure and help the rest of the organization track progress towards those goals
Yeah.
to be at a very high level. The engineering team is responsible for the technology decision in terms of the tools and the stack, so on and so forth. And and so the aligning the roadmap of the analytics team and the data engineering team at a lot of time, sometimes a lot of time is best done before budgets, right?
Yeah.
Is actually a very critical exercise to do because it helps both organizations, one, make sure that they're executing a roadmap that is going to prioritize
Yeah.
the strategic goals of the company, and then make sure that they are not in conflict with each other. They're not
Hmm.
in conflict in terms of the topics, but also in terms of the timing, right? If I need recruiting data in Q1 and you're not prioritizing simplifying recruiting data until Q4, we're going to have a problem,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so that strategic conversation from a roadmap definition and strategy level, 1 to 2 times a year should make sense. Then on a monthly and biweekly, the monthly and biweekly cadence of the teams, the working teams, is really around kind of breaking down that roadmap, the project plan again of that roadmap to
Yeah.
make sure that the alignments are still there because business priorities change,
Of course.
and also um, dealing with the specific transactions, and i.e. the request for enhancement, request for new data, request for new ingestion, request for changing the ingestion frequency. We
Yeah.
need daily data instead of weekly data. And so the higher frequency meetings are really more supporting the strategic meetings that happen 1 or 2 times a year, depending on how budgets are determined. So that's what we did at Meta, and it worked extremely well
Yeah.
because we literally went line by line. Here is what I'm trying to do on the analytics side. Here are the data needs that I have as it relates to these priorities.
Yeah.
Does this data exist? How, and where do you have them on your roadmap? Do they have the same P0 or P1 priority level than I have?
Yeah.
And it makes the conversation much, much, much more transparent, and you have more empathy
Yeah.
for your colleagues because you understand the limitations in which they operate, and vice versa. It
Yeah.
just makes for working relationships overall.
Yeah. Well, I think that is, I mean, learning from someone like yourself, learning from a company like Meta, Meta are one of those companies that are privileged, in a privileged position to be able to invest heavily, recruit the best of the best, and like make sure that those roadblocks are removed and everybody's getting the best sort of best case scenario for their day-to-day job and things like that. But it doesn't stop like other companies taking a look at that or listening to you right now and going and trying to taking, putting a mirror to themselves, putting a mirror to the organization and saying like, we're not doing that right now. And there's
Right.
clearly a sort
Or
of,
there may be some elements that you're doing well and some other
yeah.
elements that are a bit more of a bottleneck. I have to give credit to Alexis Fink, who was my lead at Meta. She is really a spectacular leader who really pushed her entire leadership team to make sure that we had these alignment. It was very natural to me because that's what I've always done.
Yeah.
But to see that at scale was something that I was, I was very, very privileged to be part of and to execute against. It really, really, kudos to Alexis, and I've learned a lot from her.
Yeah, and I guess that's goes back to that career progression and growth, right? Is learning from the best people and identifying when you are surrounded by some incredibly experienced and talented and intelligent people. Make sure you are learning from them and working with them and stuff. Don't waste an opportunity like that.
Okay.
And then what this next topic is more around like that community and the culture. I wanted you to explain it because I feel like you explain it a bit better than I do, and then we can dive into it. But explain sort of this next topic around that the community, and then dive into like I guess the importance of the investment from organizations into this, because I think it is incredibly important. I do think, and I obviously I work with tons of different organizations. And it's definitely something that gets overlooked by a lot of companies. And I think, I'll let you explain the next topic.
Happy to. So the premise for this for me and how we came in our original conversation is that I am my human capital, like the relationships that I have,
Yeah,
is my most sacred kind of investment.
yeah,
And so when you apply the analytics lens to it, and throughout my career, what it has meant is that I've always had an analytics village. I used to tell them, "Oh, you in my kangaroo pouch," like, right? I'm not Australian, obviously, but I love kangaroos. And as I met people along the way, be them the data engineer, the solutions architect, you name it, I would literally put them in my kangaroo pouch as people who would be my go-to and who I made sure they knew I would be available to them for whatever they thought that I could be helpful to them for,
yeah,
and build a community of like-minded geeks who could spend 3 hours talking about data, the possibility of data, and kind of troubleshoot code, so on and so
yeah,
forth. And over the years, I've realized that, to your point, it is an area that leaders don't always think about it from a strategic standpoint. And what I mean by this is that having and valuing a analytics guild in an organization, i.e., a community of people, of all of the people who touch data within
yeah,
an organization,
yeah,
particularly if the operating model is a federated one, right? One where there's an analytics team in sales, and it's an analytics team in marketing, one in HR, so on and so forth.
yeah,
It's very powerful because no function exists inside in a silo. You cannot run sales without understanding the sales force,
yeah,
right? You cannot do finance without understanding the sales organization,
yeah,
right? They generate the revenues. And so invariably, the analytics professionals who sit in each of those organizations have a perspective of the business and are solving problems as it relates to their microcosm of the universe,
Yeah.
that if we don't kind of make sure, to my point earlier, look to the left and to the right to find out who are the other people who touch the data so that we can connect the dots
Yeah.
to solve more complex problems,
Yeah.
right? Imagine a situation like an M&A, right? Going through a merger and acquisition, and you need to figure out how to consolidate function, where the data is, so on and so forth. Having an analytics guild as part of the culture of a company
Yeah.
make those type of activities much more efficient. What I also believe, and I shared that with you before, it is a great talent management investment, because no matter how much you love your job, usually after, I don't know, 3, 5 years, you want to do something else, right? And it behooves organizations to retain that talent by being able to move them in different parts
Yeah.
of the organization, because and if they're exposed to those other groups that do analytics
Yeah.
in those other functions, there's a higher likelihood that they can see a path forward within the company versus looking outside. The cost of replacing a high performing professional is a good 150% of their salary. And
Yeah.
you're a recruiter, so you know the
Yeah.
further up in from a leadership perspective and the more technical roles, when you have attrition in that space, it takes one, a longer time to replace them,
Yeah.
and two, any newcomers, new hires has a ramp up that is for onboarding that is at best, I don't know, 12 months, in some companies, 18 months before you actually feel like you know what you're doing.
Yeah.
There is a strategic advantage to having analytics communities and nurturing those communities, because some of the most complex problems that a company has can be solved by those groups. At Comcast, I remember my first foray in this space, Comcast, circa 2014. I had realized that I had a couple of people in my kangaroo pouch who were touching data that my team needed, but that we did not have access to. Okay. So I put a meeting on the calendar called "Let's Solve the World's Problem with Data." That literally was the title of the meeting. And they all came to the table. I had food because I love to feed people. And we did a round table, discussing, kind of introducing ourselves, talking about the data that we touch in the organization. And you could see, like, within 30 seconds, people was like, "Oh, I've been looking for this data. I didn't know that it existed." And in the follow-up meetings that came from that series of meetings around, let's solve problems using the data that we each touch,
Yeah.
was quite incredible. So that's one of the reasons that I am, from that point forward, I've always kind of made sure that that sense of community is part of what I bring to the table.
I think that's brilliant. I mean, it kind of goes back to that mindset of just as a sports analogy. There's no point having, on a soccer field, 11 of the best players in the world if they're not playing as a team. And if you got all of your midfielders are training separately with your defenders and separately from your goalkeepers, separately from your forwards, if they're not working together, you don't know what you've got on the other part of the team.
Right.
Which again, I hear all the time. You're probably not surprised by this at all, but it's really not that big of an investment space for organizations. And I think if you do have multiple areas of the business that are using data science and analytics, like you said, the sales and marketing, the finance, the HR, wherever it may be,
German, yes.
they're all working on their own individual little projects and things like that. And it's probably all coming from the same huge data set, right? But they're taking the pieces that they need.
Mm-hmm.
But it's absolutely interesting there. And then, like you said, with regards to the, I guess, just the investment into it. and companies not realizing the importance of it, because the retention side of it, I mean, obviously I'm in the recruitment space. I see what it does really cost to replace someone. Obviously, whether you use an agency like ourselves, it comes with a fee. That's just scratching the surface really of what the cost actually is in having a
Yes.
void seat, especially someone like you who's heading up a whole sort of data org and things like that. If you get fed up because you're not quite getting the access to the data engineering side and what you want, you can't answer the questions of the executives because the solutions and the questions that you're coming up with aren't, it's not possible to be solved with the data access that you've got or whatever it may be. Obviously I'm just making up a sort of scenario here, but you get ultimately, if you get fed up and leave because you're not able to do your job to the fullest,
Yes.
another another company comes along and says, well, we promise you, like, you'll be able to do all of this stuff, this is exactly what we need, then you're going to go, and then now that seat's void, and then to replace someone like yourself, it's going to be expensive because
Yes. Yes.
you've got the time that the seat's empty, you've got the recruitment fees, you've got the maybe the agency fee, if not agency fee, certainly your internal recruitment team are busy with that. And then, like you said as well, you've got that probably 12 to 18 month ramp up before they've really hit their stride in their role.
Yes. Yes.
So yeah, I think it's brilliant. I'm
It
glad you brought it up.
it's really so interestingly enough, while one of the projects that I worked on at Comcast when I was earlier in my career there in
Yeah,
HR analytics, um, I was to build a model for the cost of attrition.
yeah,
Okay. And so all of the steps that you're talking about, I built in that model. By just by that time, I had developed relationships with different HR business partners with whom I sat and I kind of tried to understand from different part of the organizations, what does it look like in terms of, I had attrition numbers, so we were talking about, okay, what does it mean for your business
yeah,
when this type of talent leaves, right? And so I put it together into a model that also included, and this was a lot of fun because I had to do some outside research, benchmark research for that. There is the cost of disengagement, okay, and it's the productivity cost. And so what I mean is that the moment someone has decided that they no longer want to be here,
yeah.
as in the company, their productivity is not the same,
Like
right?
human
They're
nature,
high.
right?
It's human nature,
Yeah,
right? And so for me, it was important to account for that because that seemed to be a gray area that the best leaders who knew that that attrition was expensive still were not thinking about those parts. And I was like, well, before the person gives their notice or we find out that we need to open a rec, for maybe 3 months while this person is interviewing with other companies, they are not giving you their best because they've checked out.
yeah,
And
yeah, yeah,
there's a cost for that. And so if you bake that in, and then you bake, to your point, the ramp up time for a new hire, assume that they're a quality hire,
yeah,
then we are talking about a good 50% of the salary is of the live of their treated employee is baked in just replacing them. Like
yeah,
that number is ridiculous,
yeah, yeah.
right? But it's you have to do it from in a holistic way. And so I was smiling as you were talking because it reminded me of that work, and it was fascinating. It was fascinating.
It's part of, like, obviously, not to dive too much into our side of the business, but like it's part of like I guess our pitch to our service, right? We want to do business with clients and things like that, but part of it is sometimes a manager will be like, it's okay, the internal recruitment team is looking at this, but the role's been open for 100 days already, and it's like, well, what's the
That
cost
time
of,
to feel metric, yes.
yeah, like I get that we've got a fee attached to us, but if we can find you the right person in the next 5 days, because we're like networking daily in this space, what's the cost of keeping that role open for maybe another 100 days versus 5 days through us or whatever? So, some people see
And then there's
it.
the resulting attrition, right? So if it's a people leader who left, the longer a team is without the leader, the more insecurity and uncertainty starts. It starts kind of creeping into the morale of the team. And so it's a trickle down effect. So
Yeah. It's interesting.
yeah.
It's actually if you could get like the perfect model around there's a quantifiable number about how big of an impact every lever of every business has on financially on the company. That'd be, I think, a business around that. That's
There you
a
go.
billion-dollar business right there. But we've gone on longer than anticipated, so I was going to sort of wrap it up. I kind of mentioned this to you before, and I've done it on our previous episodes and stuff. But you know, Dr. Yasmine today,
Mhm.
versus Dr. Yasmine day one stepping into was BCG your first professional role?
At grad school. Yep.
Day one, you've got the job at BCG. You're officially a BCG at day one. What would you today give yourself in terms of advice? Like, what you got one piece of advice. What's that main piece of advice you would give to yourself stepping into that BCG office for the first time?
Be transparent, right? And what I mean by that is pay attention to what you like, what you don't like, and what you want to do, particularly the piece that you want to do,
Yeah,
and be transparent and vocal about it, in a respectful way, right, but don't keep it to yourself, because the other people are not in your head.
yeah,
And while you may be working hard to make sure that you add value to the organization, you still have to voice your your desire and your desires and your aspiration.
yeah,
If you want a stretch project, make sure that you tell your leader, I want a stretch project. If
yeah,
there's another part of the organization that you find interesting, make sure that you do the network and find out more about that organization so that you can put that as part of your career path.
yeah,
Whatever the case is, be transparent about your intent, about your aspirations, and but it also means be transparent when you have to say mea culpa if you make a
yeah.
mistake, right? That part I think that I've done well over the years.
Yeah.
But be
Is it something?
transparent.
Is it something that you maybe lacked when you started out and learned, sort of going through the years?
Yes, the part about saying what I want and what I'm shooting for,
Yeah.
I only expressed it with my mentors. Right.
Right.
I remember Sharice. So Sharice Lilly was a spectacular leader at Comcast. She sat me down one day, and I've been at Comcast for 3, 4 years. She asked me, first question from the get go, it's like, Yasmin, who do you want to be? And she was the first person who ever asked me that question in a
Yeah.
professional setting.
Interesting.
And the moment she asked me that question, I had the answer. And it
Yeah.
was, and this title did not exist at the time. I want to be a chief data officer. That's what I told her.
Well, well, you're
And
very much on your way to that.
and she told me, what is that? And I explained it to her.
Uh,
But that's what I mean. Like, be transparent. And
yeah.
sometimes people would prompt you, sometimes you have to be proactive
Yeah.
in putting it out there.
Awesome. I love that answer. I think it's definitely not an answer we've had so far, and I think this can be applied to not just people in the data space, but people certainly across the whole technology space. But to be honest, anyone in a career, right? You be transparent, let
Exactly.
people know what you want. They'll probably be appreciated by the company with the whole attrition and checking out early mindset, because at least if you speak to the business and say that, and they're like, well, we don't think that's going to be possible for you here, then at least you
If
know.
you leave on good terms,
Yeah,
right? Because that's the
exactly.
other
Yeah,
part of thing. There's attrition, and then there is attrition, but I still, like you heard me say earlier on, I left BCG in amazing terms. I go to alumni event every year, regardless of where I am in the world. I still
yeah,
consider myself a BCGer because of the way all of that was managed.
that's awesome.
It's super important.
Yeah, awesome. Well, Dr. Yasmine Ndassa, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you. And yeah, I appreciate you taking the time to connect, and thank you.
Sam Evans, it was such a pleasure. Thank you for the opportunity. I look forward to our next conversation.